a twisted, bloated body racked with excruciating pain, and a stench so foul it caused courtiers to faint. This was the ghastly state of Henry VIII in his final days. After his death, putrid bodily fluids seeped from his coffin, only to be licked up by stray dogs. This was the gruesome end of one of history's most notorious monarchs. Today, we uncover the shocking truth behind the death of Henry VIII of England, a tale so revolting it's rarely spoken of in full. Henry Tudor was born on June 28, 1491. When he became king at just 17, he was hailed as the most handsome prince in all of Europe, tall, athletic, with striking golden red hair and a commanding presence. A Venetian ambassador once described him as having an exceptional physique and an almost angelic face, declaring him more beautiful than any other Christian prince of his time. How did this once vibrant symbol of strength and majesty come to such a humiliating end? The downfall began with a tragic accident in January 1536 during a jousting tournament at Greenwich. At 44 years old, Henry was thrown to the ground when his horse toppled onto him. He lay unconscious for 2 hours, and though he survived, the damage to his right leg was permanent, a wound that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The injury soon turned into a festering ulcer that never fully healed, oozing constantly, and releasing a putrid stench so strong it heralded the king's arrival before he even appeared. For a man consumed by vanity, it was a crushing humiliation. Courtiers were forced to endure the foul odor without flinching. Any sign of disgust could provoke the king's fury. This incident not only disfigured his body but also marked the start of a dark shift in his personality. Coincidence or not, the accident occurred during a dark and turbulent chapter in Henry's life, the very same period when he ordered the execution of his second wife, Anne Boleyn, under charges widely believed to be fabricated: adultery, incest, and treason. Her death shocked the nation and marked a turning point in Henry's reign. Some historians argue that the severe head trauma he sustained during the jousting fall may have done more than injure his body. It may have altered his mind. They suggest the injury aggravated pre-existing traits, intensifying his paranoia, deepening his mood swings, and unleashing uncontrollable fits of rage. From that moment on, Henry seemed to grow increasingly erratic, ruthless, and distrustful, turning against even those who once held his deepest confidence. It was as if the fall not only broke his leg, but fractured his very sense of reason. As his mobility declined, Henry's weight began to soar. Once a trim and athletic young man with an 89 centimeter waist, he eventually ballooned to over 130 centimeters. His body grew so massive, tipping the scales at more than 180 kilograms, that he could no longer move unaided. A specially constructed pulley system was installed to hoist him between royal chambers, and even the doorways of his palaces had to be widened to accommodate his immense frame. The once vigorous king had become a prisoner of his own body. Henry's dramatic physical decline was fueled in large part by his extravagant royal diet. Historical kitchen records revealed that the king consumed an astonishing 5,000 calories per day, sometimes even more. His meals were dominated by heavy portions of red meat, including venison, beef, lamb, and game birds, with barely a trace of vegetables or fiber to balance it out. A typical dinner might include several types of richly seasoned meat pies, roasted joints, and stews, all washed down with copious amounts of wine and strong ale. Sweets and pastries often followed, further burdening his already strained body. This indulgent regimen, once manageable in his youth, became disastrous when paired with his increasingly sedentary lifestyle. No longer able to ride, hunt, or joust, Henry was confined to his chambers, eating lavishly, moving rarely. The result was a rapid and relentless deterioration of his health, both inside and out, accelerating his journey toward a painfully slow decline. Over time, the ulcers on Henry's legs grew increasingly severe and agonizing. In an age of limited medical knowledge, his physicians resorted to treatments that, by today's standards, were not only ineffective, but deeply harmful. They cauterized the wounds with red-hot irons, applied toxic mixtures laced with arsenic and mercury, and performed frequent bloodletting that drained his strength rather than restored it. Instead of healing, the ulcers worsened, festering and spreading until the flesh around them began to rot, exposing bone beneath the decaying tissue. It was a horrifying sight, and an even more horrifying reality for a once mighty king. The stench from Henry's festering wounds had become so overpowering that his presence could be detected from 3 rooms away. Despite his deteriorating condition, at the age of 49 he married Catherine Howard, a vivacious young woman of just 19. Henry proudly declared the union a return to youth, clinging desperately to a fantasy of lost vigor. But the stark contrast between his bloated, ulcer-ridden body and Catherine's youthful beauty turned their marriage into a macabre spectacle. The age gap, coupled with his grotesque physical state and foul odor, made intimacy unbearable. Isolated and repulsed, Catherine eventually sought affection elsewhere, finding solace in the arms of a young courtier, an act that would seal her tragic fate. When Catherine Howard's affair came to light, Henry reacted with brutal finality, ordering the execution of both his young wife and her lover. By the time he entered his 6th and final marriage in 1543, romance was no longer part of the equation. His union with Catherine Parr was largely political and practical. More caretaker than consort, Catherine served as a nurse to the ailing king, showing remarkable patience and loyalty, especially given the grim fates of the queens who came before her. In his final years, Henry was ravaged by a host of debilitating conditions. Modern medical experts believe he suffered from type 2 diabetes, chronic gout, high blood pressure, and congestive heart failure. Some have speculated about syphilis, though that diagnosis remains widely debated among historians. Whatever the exact causes, the result was the same. His body was in relentless decline, and his final years were marked by constant pain, isolation, and suffering. The once great monarch spent his last days as a shadow of the man he had once been, broken, bloated, and tormented. Contemporary accounts reveal a king caught between 2 tormenting extremes: episodes of excruciating pain during which Henry would scream and hurl curses at those nearby, and long stretches of crushing melancholy when he lay still and silent for hours on end. As his physical agony worsened, so did his paranoia. The sharp mind that once guided England's destiny grew clouded by fear and suspicion, fixating on imagined plots and betrayals. Driven by these delusions, Henry turned against even his closest friends and most loyal advisors, condemning many to death on baseless accusations. The once mighty ruler had become a prisoner of his own tortured mind. Fear gripped the royal court, where a careless word or a misunderstood glance could lead to a deadly charge of treason. The atmosphere was thick with suspicion and dread. In a grim testament to his growing paranoia, Henry ordered the execution of Henry Howard, Earl of Surrey, a mere 9 days before his own death. His terror of being poisoned consumed him entirely, prompting the creation of an elaborate and paranoid food safety ritual. Servants were forced to sample every dish before it reached the king's table, a desperate measure to guard against imagined threats in what had become a court ruled by fear. Every utensil and dish was subjected to meticulous inspection, reflecting Henry's growing obsession with safety and control. This fixation likely stemmed from his worsening mental state, possibly a consequence of recurring minor strokes that clouded his judgment and fueled his paranoia. As his final days drew near, Henry's physical suffering became almost unbearable. By his last months he was nearly immobile, reliant entirely on others for the simplest movements. Gangrene had taken hold of his legs, worsening the foul odor that had long surrounded him and adding a new layer of torment to his already excruciating decline. The royal court had become a suffocating chamber of miasma and hushed whispers. Courtiers, desperate to mask the overwhelming stench, clutched perfume-soaked handkerchiefs tightly over their noses, struggling to maintain composure and obedience in the presence of their ailing monarch. The air was thick not only with the foul odor but with fear and sorrow. During the harsh winter of 1546 to 1547, Henry's condition plummeted precipitously. He was plagued by relentless high fevers, symptoms now believed to have been caused by septicemia, a deadly blood infection triggered by the countless untreated wounds and infections ravaging his body. Each day brought new waves of pain and weakness, as the once powerful king slowly succumbed to the cascading effects of his failing health. The court watched in silent dread, knowing that the end was drawing near. His breathing grew labored and shallow, each gasp a struggle against the mounting weight of death. Episodes of delirium became more frequent, during which those nearby heard the king muttering the names of his deceased wives. Jane Seymour, who had died shortly after giving birth to his only legitimate son, seemed to haunt his fading consciousness, most of all. Some even whispered that Anne Boleyn's restless spirit tormented him in these fevered moments, as if the ghosts of his past continued to cast long shadows over his final days. Remarkably, despite Henry's clearly terminal condition, no one at court dared openly acknowledge that the king was dying. Under English law, even predicting the monarch's death was considered treason, a dangerous silence that gripped the entire royal household. Physicians and courtiers alike upheld a fragile facade of hope, insisting on the possibility of recovery, even as the foul odor of decay began to seep from Henry's living body. This grim denial persisted until January 27, 1547, when the inevitable finally came to pass. Aware that his final moments were approaching, Henry at last permitted Archbishop Thomas Cranmer to come to his bedside. Though too weak to speak, he grasped Cranmer's hand firmly when asked if he wished to die in the Christian faith, his last deliberate act of consciousness. In the quiet hours of January 28, 1547, at the age of 55, the once mighty king drew his final breath, bringing to an end a reign marked by both grandeur and torment. But the indignities did not cease with Henry's death. His immense size demanded the construction of a specially designed coffin large enough to hold his massive remains. Preparing his body for burial proved a grim and daunting task for the royal embalmers. In an era when embalming was still rudimentary, the process mainly involved removing the internal organs and filling the cavities with fragrant herbs and spices to mask decay. Yet, given the king's condition, this was far from straightforward. A macabre challenge that underscored the tragic reality of his final days. In the days following his death, as Henry's body lay in state awaiting the grand funeral, one of the most macabre episodes of his passing unfolded. The coffin, poorly sealed and ill-equipped to contain the swelling gases and oozing fluids of decomposition, began to leak while resting in the chapel of Can Abbey. According to contemporary accounts, a chilling scene took place during the night, one that would be remembered for its grotesque and unsettling nature. Putrid fluids seeped from the coffin, trickling onto the chapel floor where they were discovered and eagerly lapped up by stray dogs. Chroniclers of the time recorded this ghastly scene, capturing a profoundly humiliating and tragic end for a monarch who had crafted his legacy on power, majesty, and divine right. The mighty Henry VIII, who had defied the Pope, reshaped the English Church, and condemned two of his wives to the scaffold, met his final fate not as a revered king, but as a decaying mass of flesh, a stark reminder of mortality's inescapable grip. His body, desecrated by scavenging animals, lay in a coffin that still emitted an unbearable stench. Nearly 3 weeks after his death, on February 16, 1547, Henry's funeral was finally held. Despite the overwhelming odor that permeated the air, the ceremonies unfolded with the full grandeur and solemnity befitting a monarch of his stature. He was laid to rest in St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle, alongside Jane Seymour, the only wife to give him the long-awaited male heir, Edward VI. Ironically, Edward VI, the son whose birth had driven many of Henry's most controversial decisions, including the break with Rome, reigned for only 6 short years before succumbing to illness at the age of 15. The throne then passed to Mary the Rere, daughter of Catherine of Aragon, who sought to undo her father's Protestant reforms and restore Catholicism. Finally, Elizabeth I, daughter of Anne Boleyn, ascended to the throne, ushering in a golden age that would become one of the most celebrated periods in English history. The grotesque death of Henry VIII stands as a stark reminder of the limits of human power and ambition. A king who once saw himself above the law, capable of reshaping a nation's religion and deciding the fate of countless lives at will, was ultimately brought low by the frailty of his own mortal body. His passing marked not only the end of a man, but also the symbolic close of an era defined by both grandeur and turmoil. English historian Alison Weir once observed, "One of history's greatest paradoxes is how a man who started life with such promise, beauty, and talent ended as a grotesque shadow of his former self, tormented by relentless physical pain and mental turmoil, surrounded by fear and flattery, yet seldom, if ever, truly loved." The transformation of Henry VIII, from an ideal Renaissance prince to an obese, ailing tyrant, remains one of history's most compelling examples of how absolute power, compounded by chronic pain and deteriorating health, can fundamentally change a person. Despite his personal decline, his political legacy endures. The break from Rome and the foundation of the Anglican Church continue to influence the course of modern history. Yet Henry's personal decline stands as a powerful testament to human fragility. The final moments of his life, marked by labored breaths and a ravaged, deformed body, stand in stark contrast to the grand portraits that immortalize him in all his regal splendor. This striking gap between public image and private reality remains one of the most profound lessons from his life and death. Hus ended the life of one of history's most infamous monarchs, not in glory, but shrouded in unbearable decay and a fate unworthy of his crown. The man who reshaped England and altered the course of Western history ultimately met the same fate as all mortals, succumbing to the relentless decay of the flesh. Henry VIII's death was more than a historical event. It was a profound symbol of the fleeting nature of power. As his body deteriorated, so too did the illusion of royal invincibility. The monarchy, long seen as a divine and untouchable institution, above the laws of nature, was forced to confront its own mortality. The ultimate irony of Henry VIII's life is that the king who went to extraordinary lengths, including breaking with Rome and executing 2 wives, to secure a male heir, was left with a frail son who died young. Yet, his lasting legacy emerged through his daughters, especially Elizabeth I, the daughter of the very woman he had executed on false charges, who would go on to shape a remarkable era in English history. Perhaps the most profound lesson from Henry VIII's death is that not even absolute power can overcome the limits of the human body. The king who reshaped his nation's laws to fulfill his own desires was powerless to alter the immutable laws of nature. In the end, even the mightiest monarch must face the same fate as the humblest of subjects. The death of Henry VIII is more than a tale of medical horror. It is a moral story about the limits of human power and the inevitability of physical decline. The very body once celebrated as the epitome of royal grandeur became a stark symbol of the fleeting nature of earthly glory. This narrative reminds us that in the end, death levels all distinctions regardless of status or achievement. The grim fate of Henry VIII continues to captivate and unsettle us precisely because it exposes the fragile humanity lurking beneath the facade of absolute power. Henry VIII's story is a vivid reminder that no matter how powerful we may seem, we are all bound by our humanity and the passage of time. Reflect on the true nature of power, legacy, and mortality in your own life. Share this story to remind others that humility and compassion endure far beyond crowns and titles. What lessons will you carry forward from the rise and fall of a king?